and ask some questions if need be. So it says factor each completely. This one we just look at it, and our first step is always factor out the greatest common factor as possible, right, everybody? So like, what's the greatest thing in common right here on this first one? X, right? GCF, right? And a lot of people get going and do A times C and adds up to be B, and that would be not good because you see how there's an X in common. So everybody, we would factor out an X, right? Now you've got to make sure you factor out the X. Don't just divide X. It doesn't magically disappear into thin air. So we have an X that we pulled out. Now we can go back and divide each term by X. But that X, what you pulled out, it's got to be in your answer. So now what's left in the first term? X, correct everybody? X squared divided by X. And then look, negative 4X divided by X is negative 4. Now you can check your answers, you guys, because you better have what you factored out there still in your answer. There's our answer, but you can check it. Look, factoring is the opposite of multiplication. So let's check our answer. X times X, let's multiply it back together as X squared, right? X times negative 4 is negative 4X. Didn't we end up back at the start? So do you see how you can check your answers on these? Factored is the exact opposite of multiplication. You're just pulling it apart, whereas multiplication, you're putting it together. Okay, let's do this one. So you'd say, okay, we can factor that, but there's no greatest common factor. So it's quadratic, so we do what multiplies to be A times C and adds up to be B. You guys have actually done really well with factoring. That is literally one of the hardest things for my students coming from secondary 2 to secondary 3 is not being able to factor, and you guys have done really well with it. So what multiplies, now careful though, because A is 1, correct? B is 6, and C is negative 7. Because remember, quadratics have the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So everybody, do you see how it's in standard form? That's probably the first thing we should check. It is, so now we can do what multiplies to be A times C, what multiplies to be negative 7, right? 1 times negative 7, and adds up to be B, which is 6. So we're doing A times C and adds up to be B. Please ask questions if you do. Okay, factors of 7 are 1 times 7. Are there any other factors of 7? No. Now we need to make this so that it adds up to be positive 6. Positive 6, right? So which one should be negative? So it'll add up to be positive 6. 1, right, everybody? So now look, negative 1 plus 7 equals positive 6, and negative 1 times positive 7 is negative 7. So it checks off in both cases. So then we drop our n terms down, and we break our middle term down. So we drop down n squared, we drop down negative 7, exactly as it is. Then we're rewriting this middle term as these two factors. Now order doesn't matter, so I'll just put in minus 1n plus 7n. Is everybody feeling good? Now remember, this is going to be on the test too. If there's 4 terms, don't we factor by grouping at this point? So we put groups now. So we'll put parentheses around the first 2 and around the second 2. Remember, we always include that sign. The greatest thing in common here is an n. Won't we pull out an n? Everybody good? And then we'll divide by n, divide by n. So left is n minus 1, yeah? What's in common here? It's we pull out this sign, right? It's positive 7. So we're pulling out positive 7, divide by 7, divide by 7. So look, left is n and then minus 1. Check your safe haven. We've done this correctly because it's the same. Even the sign's the same. If not, you've either done something wrong or picked the wrong factors. That should help you. Now we'll factor out that n minus 1. You'll pull it out. You can't stop here. You'll get it wrong. We pulled out n minus 1. So now it divided out, but we had to pull it out first. And then left was n plus 7. Now we have 1, 2 linear factors. Remember, linear means degree 1. That's when you know you're done with factoring. Does that make sense, everybody? So look, at this example, then we end up with 1, 2 linear factors. Degree 1, degree 1. Okay, are you guys ready to practice those on your test review? Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to do is push pause, and I'm going to have you do problems. Solve by factoring. Solve by factoring. So on the next part of the test, you've got to know the difference. If you go on the front of the test and start solving, and it says factor, you're going to get them wrong. So if it says factor, you stop at factoring. If it says solve by factoring, we've got to go completely down until we have solutions. Okay? Does everybody understand the difference? What I'm saying, okay? So you've got to factor it, then continue to solve it. So the first step is, before you can solve by factoring, this is the most important thing. It has to be equal to 0 and in standard form. Standard form means highest degree to the next highest degree to the next highest degree. Highest degree to lowest degree. So look at this one. Do you see how it is not equal to 0? Everybody? So that's our first step. We've got to make it equal to 0 using algebra. You can't just pull 4 and float it over. You've got to use algebra. Isn't this positive 4? So we would subtract 4. Now you can't just do that to this side of the equation. You'll do it to this side of the equation as well. Now over here on the right, we're going to combine like terms. There are no x squareds besides x squared. There are no x's besides 3x. There is only one constant, negative 4. So none of these are like terms, so we can't combine them. We have x squared minus 3x minus 4. Now look on this side of the equation. You better check. Does that plus that equal 0? Yes. So we've done this correctly. Next thing, you've got to check this. Is it in standard form? Highest degree, x squared. Next highest degree is x, right? Then our constant. Do you see how we're good? Now we can solve by factoring. So our first step is factor it. There's no greatest common factor. So we would do a times c. So isn't my a value 1, guys? 1 times negative 4. What multiplies to be a times c and adds up to be b? What multiplies to be 1 times negative 4, that's a times c. Our b value is negative 3. That would be 1 times 4, 2 times 2. Those are factors of 4. I've listed them all out so that I can make sure I find the factors. 2 and 2 could never add up to be negative 3. 1 and 4 could. This negative would have to be with the 4, right? To have it add to be negative 3, right? So look, positive 1 times negative 4 does equal negative 4. 1 plus negative 4 does equal negative 3. So we found our factors. So now we can drop and break. Drop your n terms down. So we drop down positive x squared. We drop down negative 4. Then we break down our middle term, rewriting it as these two factors but with x's. Order doesn't matter. So I'll just say positive 1x minus 4x. Now we group the first two terms. We group the last two terms, including the sign. The greatest thing in common here is an x, so I pull out an x, divide by x, divide by x. So right here left is an x, and a 1, plus 1. Right here, I'm pulling out a negative 4, so I'll pull out negative 4, divide by negative 4. Careful here, negative 4 is divided out to be positive 1. 1 times x is just x. Look, a negative 4 divided by a negative 4 is positive 1. Our safe haven's the same, we've done it correctly. So we'll factor that out, pull out x plus 1. It divides out, left is x minus 4. Now this one said solve, so we're not done. Our last step is to say, okay, up here, it was equal to 0. So down here, now it's just in factored form, it's still equal to 0. Now we can split those apart and set each of those equal to 0. So we say, okay, we're going to have x plus 1 equals 0, and we have x minus 4 equals 0. Now you'll use algebra to solve for x. It's just simple algebra. What would we do? Subtract 1, right? What just happened? My projector went out! Okay, let's just do a couple more, maybe one more example where we're solving by factoring real quick. So with something like this on the test, you need to make sure it's equal to 0. Now what you're going to want to tend to do, is you're going to want to bring x squared over because you think that's just one step. But that's going to make it harder because then your leading term will be negative, which would be fine, but it just makes it a little bit harder. So what I would do is bring these both over using algebra this way. So to bring those over, let's go ahead and we would add 10x, right? Add 10x. So that would be x squared plus 10x. And that's equal to negative 9 now, because do you see how those become 0? So then from there we would add 9, right? Make it equal to 0. Hi. I think I already sent them down. It may have, I think so. Yeah. So then right here we would add 9, right? Add 9. So we have x squared plus 10x plus 9 equals 0. So then from there we would do, okay, now it's in standard form. So now we do what multiplies to be a times c, which is 9, and adds up to be b, which is 10. Wouldn't that be 1 and 9, everybody? Okay. So we quickly drop and break, and then I think you guys are good from there, right? We're good from there? Okay, so we won't keep doing that. So if you have this one, we would bring this 2x over, so we would add 2x. So that's x squared plus 2x equals 0. We'll solve it by factoring. This one has a GCF, a greatest common factor. So we'll factor out x, then left would be x plus 2, right? Now don't make the mistake of saying, okay, I don't know how to solve that. Yes, you do. Set each of them equal to 0. So we'll have x equals 0, and we'll have x plus 2 equals 0. So solve for x. 0 is just a number like any other number. So if you ever get 0 as a solution, it shouldn't throw you off. Does that make sense, everybody? And then we'd subtract 2, so x is equal to negative 2. We have 2 solutions. Make sure with all quadratics you should have 2 solutions. Does everybody understand how to do those? Do you need another couple minutes to practice those? Or we move on to the next one on your worksheet. Okay, I'll give you a couple minutes to keep practicing those ones. Check them with me. All right, so this next part seems to be kind of the harder one for people. So it says find the zeros, find the vertex, find the axis of symmetry, find the y-intercept, and whatnot. We'll go through and do this. So we're going to first graph it. We're going to graph this appropriately. So first of all, we can do this a couple different ways. I personally, in standard form, I will go through and I'll find the zeros and then graph those first. Does that make sense, everybody? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's find the zeros. So why don't we find it by factoring? There's a greatest common factor. There's an x in common, so left is x plus 4, right? Everybody see what I did? So I get x is equal to 0, and I get x is equal to negative 4. Because when we set each of those equal to 0 and solve. Does everybody understand how I got that? So that's where it crosses the x-axis. When we solve the quadratic, when we solve it, we find where it crosses the x-axis. So I'm going to plot points at 0 and at negative 4. Now, don't we know, okay, there's a couple of different ways we can find the axis of symmetry. We did learn how to do it by saying x is equal to negative b over 2 times a. So do you want to do it that way, since we did it that way? And we've also learned, isn't it going to be halfway between those two values? So either way, whatever you want to do. So we know it's going to be halfway between the zeros, so don't we know it's going to be at x equals negative 2? That's our axis of symmetry. So look, that's also what we get here. Negative b, isn't this b? Ax squared plus bx plus c. So b is 4, right? So negative 4 all over 2 times a. A is 1, so 2 times 1. So do you see how we get negative 4 over 2, which is negative 2? So do you see how we get negative 2, just 2 different ways? So that's what I'm going to draw in next is my axis of symmetry. It's just this. It's not actually there. Remember, it's just we like to draw it in because we know our parabola is going to be symmetric around that. We draw in a little dotted line. Now, remember that that's just the x value of your vertex. So we know it's at negative 2, but we have no idea how high up. Maybe it's up here at 6. Maybe it's down here at negative 5. Does that make sense? So when we just plug in, this is an x, y point, right? When we just plug this in for x, negative 2 in, and then we'll know where our y is. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to say, okay, we know y is equal to, we're plugging in negative 2 for x. We've got to use parentheses. That's really important. Negative 2 squared plus 4 times negative 2. So we get, let's calculate that. Let's all practice that really quick. What is that? If you don't use parentheses, you'll get it wrong. So everybody, including good people with just a scientific calculator, type it in. Negative 2 times negative 2. What do we get? 4. Okay, 4. And then we have minus 8, correct? Because 4 times negative 2. Does everybody understand? 4 minus 8 is negative 4. So we have negative 2, negative 4. It's no longer a question mark. So that's what we're going to graph as our vertex. We're going to go negative 2, negative 4. Does everybody understand? Then remember, I want like 2 other points on the graph. So y-intercept would be good, but isn't this where it crosses the y-axis as well? Look. Okay, so, and then let's find one other point. So remember, I'm okay at this point for you to type that into y equals and then go to the table of values and plot some more points. So can somebody give me some more x, y points? Maybe like one more. if we can fit it on this graph. -3, -3. Okay, perfect. -3, -3. So let's graph that. -3, -3. Awesome. And then -1, -3. Isn't that also a point? -1, -3. So we have enough points to draw in this U. Does everybody see it now? Okay, so now we'll draw that in. And now we'll go through and answer. So we'll draw it in as pretty as possible. Now look, it's symmetric around the axis of symmetry. Meaning if I folded it like a sandwich over that line, it would look the exact same. Does everybody see it? Let's answer the question. It says find the zeros. We've done that. So we would say the zeros on our test will answer x is equal to -4 and -1. I'm just going to go like that. We have two solutions for zeros. Now on your test, you can't miss any of these. So cross it off for yourself. You say, okay, I found the zeros. Now we'll find the vertex. Wasn't it -2, -4, guys? Vertex is the lowest point, right? Or highest point. So we would say the vertex is -2, -4. Do we have questions on that? Then it says find the axis of symmetry. So our axis of symmetry was x is equal to -2. We'll answer that. It says find the y-intercept. That's when x equals 0, right? Y-intercept. Isn't that when the x will be 0? So plug in 0 into the function. Won't that be 0? 0 squared plus 4 times 0 is 0. You all understand what I'm saying? So the y-intercept, we plugged in 0, and we got 0. So it's not a question mark. We got 0, 0. That's our y-intercept. Look, that is where it's crossing the y-axis. Do you see how you can just look, too? Isn't that where it's crossing the y-axis at 0, 0, everybody? And then it says, okay, so we've answered all the questions except for domain and range. Okay, oh, we're getting there. So domain. Domain is where is your function growing from left to right. Now, it doesn't matter that it's growing up. That's not domain. Domain is where's it going that way and that way. Isn't it growing outwards like this forever? Yeah? So it's growing from -infinity to +infinity. Our range is our lowest y value to the highest y value, yes. For quadratics, yeah. Yep. So domain is how far down to up is your function growing. So where does my function start? What's the lowest y value? -4, and it's growing to +infinity, right? So that's what we say for range. We're not going to miss these on the test. -4 to +infinity. Now, it did start right at -4, so this gets a bracket. And then infinity just always gets a parenthesis, because infinity is not a number. It's just like a place. And then it says, where's the function increasing and decreasing? So, increasing and decreasing intervals. So, aren't we coming in, if we look at it from left to right, if we stepped on this one, we'd be going downhill from left to right. So are we decreasing? Now it's x values where you're decreasing, x values. So are we coming in from -infinity till we hit the x value of -2? Does everybody understand? We're decreasing from -infinity. We're going down the hill till we hit x value -2. Increasing and decreasing just always gets parentheses. Then look, right after -2, we started to, after x is equal to -2, we started to increase to +infinity. So we are increasing from -2 to +infinity. Those increasing and decreasing always get parentheses. So do you see how it's not too bad, but you do have to know what you're doing. You have to answer all the questions and not miss anything. So I'm going to say, okay, now I've answered all of it, so I'm good. Does everybody understand? We're all not confused, nothing. I'm not going to do this one, but on the test there'll be two types. So it's the same thing though. It says find the zeros, so we'd have to do it by factoring, right? So I'm just going to tell you what they'd be. We would get x is equal to -1, what multiplies these? 3, and adds up to be 4. So we'll get x is equal to -1 and x is equal to -3. Okay, everybody? So you would go through and factor it and solve by factoring. Now we'll graph those. -1 and -3. So those are the zeros. So we've answered that part. Find the zeros. There they are. It says find the vertex. Won't it be halfway between the zeros? So isn't my vertex at -2? Again. So my vertex is at -2 comma something. So we plug in -2 into our function. That's -2 squared plus 4 times -2 plus 3. So that's 4 minus 8 plus 3. So that's whatever that is, negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1, right? So it's negative 2, negative 1. Do you see what I'm doing here? So negative 2, negative 1, there's my vertex. So now I've answered that, my vertex. The axis of symmetry was x is equal to negative 2. And then we can graph the y-intercept. That's when x is equal to 0. So it's 0 comma something. So plug 0 in. So 0 squared 0 plus 4 times 0 0. So isn't it going to be at 3? So 0 comma 3 is our y-intercept. So let's graph that. Over 0, up 3. There's it's crossing the y-axis. And then you could find another point using your table of values, but here's another point you would find, and that's plenty. You can see the parabola now. So you would draw it in, and then you would go through and do domain and range, and increasing and decreasing. Does everybody understand? Okay, how about you guys practice that for a second on your test review? Ready, set, go. Some of these you can't graph the y-intercept, I've noticed, just because it doesn't fit on the graph, but that's okay. Do your best. Graph what you can. You're doing 9 and 10. Yeah. Make sure you practice well. You need to be able to do it on the test. And check them with me. Find the 0, step up, find that symmetry, find vertex. You're looking for multiplies to be a times b, and that's what 2b. That's how we solve those quadratic, right? And then that's where it crosses the x-axis. You'll be solving it like you did on the 5 and 8, 5, 6, 7, and 8.
crap, I was recording.
Factor. So it says factor, so this takes us back to like the first test, kind of, but we've had some practice with this test as well. It says factor. So notice it's not quadratic. Isn't it degree 3, everybody? But do you see how we have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms? This is when we factor by grouping. 4 terms is factor by grouping. So we group the first 2 terms, we group the second 2 terms, including the sign, so it's just like a quadratic factoring continuum. What's the greatest thing in common here? X squared, right? So we'll pull out x squared. Let's all right there think about this. So now you'll divide each term by x squared. So what's x cubed divided by x squared, guys? X, right? Everybody following? You're going to have these on the test. Then look, x squared over x squared is 1, so we're left with plus 2. Over here, the greatest thing in common is positive 4. So we'll divide each term by positive 4. That's not a negative, sorry. Positive 4. So then left is x plus 2. Is your safe haven the same? If so, you know you've done it correctly, but don't stop here. You're not done. We've got to factor out x plus 2. Now we pulled that out, so we pulled it out, put it in front. Left was x squared plus 4. We factored by grouping. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, practice those 2 on the test review. So everybody, it says graph the parabola. So now look, notice how we already have graphed some, but weren't they in standard form? This one's in factored form, which makes it easier because when they were in standard form, we had to factor it and solve. This one's already factored. So our first thing is find the zeros. Since it's already factored, we'll set each of those equal to 0. So x minus 1 equals 0. We'll set x minus 7 equal to 0. So when we get x is equal to, add 1. When we get x is equal to positive 1. And we'll get x is equal to positive 7. Does everybody understand? So we'll graph that. 1 was where it crossed, because we know that's when we solve a quadratic, and it's crossing at 7. So on our axis of symmetry, be halfway between those. Let's count how many units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 total, so we need to go over 1, 2, 3 units. Does everybody see why this is the halfway mark? Yeah? So our axis of symmetry is that x is equal to 4, correct? 4? Is everybody good? So now our vertex is at 4 comma something. So when we plug in 4 up here into our function, just like we did before. So that's 4 minus 1. 4 minus 1 times 4 minus 7, guys. So that's going to be 3 times negative 3, right? Which is negative 9. So it's not going to be 4 question mark, it's 4 negative 9. So let's graph that. We'll go over 4, down 9. So that's down here off of my graph. Is everybody feeling good? I found the vertex. Now I can pretty much, we could find some more points using our x, y table by just typing that in exactly like it is, right, into y equals. And then we could go ahead and graph it. So it looks something like this. Symmetric around the axis of symmetry. And now we'll answer this. The domain, isn't it going this way forever and that way forever? So negative infinity to positive infinity. Our range is the lowest y value to the highest y value. Didn't it start at 9? Negative 9, I mean. I grew to positive infinity. So our range is negative 9 to positive infinity, includes negative 9. It's increasing from, now remember, it's x values where it's increasing. Isn't it increasing from 4 to positive infinity? You'd be walking uphill. So we're increasing from 4 to positive infinity, and increasing and decreasing always get parentheses. It's decreasing would be going downhill from negative infinity up till we hit the x value of 4. Everybody good with that one? Okay. And then the last thing is said, given the zeros, what's the quadratic? So this is the ones where we're working backwards. So we're now going backwards. Instead of actually factoring the quadratic and finding the zeros, we're now given the zeros, what's the quadratic? So remember, this is the one where we work backwards, right? Before we had this as a solution, we had a linear factor. So we subtract 3 to equal 0. So we have x minus 3 equals 0. Over here, we would add 4, So we have x plus 4 equals 0. So we're just going backwards. Remember, before they were equal to 0, they used to be multiplied together. X minus 3 times x plus 4 equals 0. So do you see how we're just going backwards? And now we'll distribute. It's got to be in standard form. So now we've got it correctly. If you get this far, I'd be ashamed to mess up on this part. X times x is x squared. X times positive 4 is positive 4x. I do not want you to sit and draw in your arrows. That defeats your purpose. Draw them in as you go. Negative 3 times x is negative 3x. Negative 3 times positive 4 is negative 12. Then we combine like terms. X squared, add those up. 4 minus 3, guys, is 1. So plus 1x. And then we have minus 12. Now look, it's in standard form. There's our quadratic in standard form that gave those as solutions. Everybody remember doing that. Okay, so now you can finish the review. If I said to you solve, we would know how to hopefully solve. We've got to remember stuff from one test to the next. This is on the last test. Solving, wouldn't we combine our x's? So we would need to go subtract 2x. Subtract 2x. So won't that be 2x plus 2 on this side? Which equals, that's 0, which equals 6. And now don't we just get x alone, guys? So what would we do? Minus 2. So we have 2x is equal to 4. And then we would divide by 2, right? So x is equal to 2. Remember, guys, we've got to remember things from the last test to be able to be on this test as well. Okay, so go ahead and finish the review. If you need to get on and watch this video, do.